community and society is creation of things, documents, images, videos. And so 4 years ago, I was sitting with our chief product officer for the Photoshop product. We were like sitting on stage watching demos from our research team of like where AI was going in Adobe's product and how easy it's going to be for our creative professional customers to make images. Things that used to take them months and months, now we're going to be able to take them minutes, change the sky, change this. And we were talking about it, and I said, well, what about the other side of it, right? Like, how easy is it going to be to deceive people when people have tools like this, and not necessarily Adobe software, but all the software out that can do these things. And so we had that conversation, and we spent a 6-month journey of thinking about, like, what could we do? Like, what's Adobe's solution to this problem, or what can we offer to the discussion on this topic? Because we believe this innovation should continue, right? AI is positive for our creative professionals, as I mentioned, is a good thing. They're using it. It makes their tools better, really allows them to express themselves digitally in ways they never could before. So the answer isn't stop, right? That didn't make any sense to us. And so we first thought about using AI as itself to detect whether or not it's a deep fake. So we have a bunch of researchers, and we gave them the problem, and we said about using AI as a deepfake detector. And so they spent 6 months looking at it, and we talked to other companies like Google, Facebook, others who are looking at the problem. And the answer kind of came back to us pretty clearly that the AI detection isn't going to be accurate enough to really a solution for the public, right? It was 50, 60% accuracy, and you can continue to train and get that number up, but the AI image creation is also going to develop and grow over time. So you're kind of at cybersecurity space of cat and mouse where one side gets better and the other gets better, and you're always sort of at a level playing field. So we didn't feel like that was the solution. Another thing that we didn't feel good about was human content moderation. And we just felt like there's a couple reasons why that's not great. First, it puts whoever's doing the human content, whether it's a tech company or a government, in the terrible position of deciding what is true and what is good and what is bad, a lot of the things Alex was talking about. The other problem with it is it takes forever, right? And so you get a social media image, a billion people have seen it in an hour, and then 3 weeks later someone tells you it might not be true. It's not helpful. So we decided to turn the problem on its head and thought, we're not going to try and create a lie detector, right? Something that tells you every time that something is fake, that it's fake, because that's this game that we've seen these approaches and that we don't think it works. What we wanted to do is think about a truth detector, a way to show that people who have something to say that is true, how can they still prove that what they're saying is true? Because what we're worried about as we go forward, and as we thought about this 3 years ago, it's not just that you're getting deceived. Now you're seeing a video in the Ukraine war and it's not true, and this thing happened, but it wasn't true, and you're forming a policy or decision based on facts that never happened. That's a problem. The real problem is once you realize you can't trust images and videos, or as the senator said, seeing is no longer believing, you're not going to believe anything that's true either. And once you stop believing true things, then I don't know how we function as a society, right? We have to be able to believe something. If the senator is up there, he says something and he's like, this is my policy initiative, we all need to be like, okay, that he did say that and it was true and I understood it. Whether you agree with it or not, who cares, right? But that fact actually happened. So that's the action we took, and that's why we thought provenance was the right answer. And also from our own experience creating images, we know how to do that. So the coalition we started 3 years ago, we're at over 800 members now. Again, it's a group of NGOs, but a lot of companies and media. So we have companies like Qualcomm, who makes this, as you know, the chips that go into all the smartphones. They've created a chip that has the SIIA technology in it. We have media companies like the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and the New York Times, the BBC, AP, Reuters. All the media companies are very interested in this question of how can I continue to communicate with my audience and say what I'm showing actually happened, right? How do I overcome that skepticism? So with all of those together, we developed this technology. And so right now, you can go from, the idea is you'll go from capture to publication. So you take the picture with your smartphone or your Nikon, who's a member camera, or Sony, who's a member camera, capture that information, it stores, and it's an opt-in solution, who you are, where you took the picture, when you took it, right? Then it goes to Photoshop. You're making all your edits. All the edits that you're making in Photoshop are captured, right? They're all part of this file. And then it goes over to the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. Their editor makes edit to it. Those edits get captured. Finally, it goes to the social media platform. The image goes up. It's got an icon. You can click on the link. You can see what happened to the image. We can show you everything that happened to the image along the way, or we can just show you, put a slider on it, and you can just see the original and see everything that happened, right? It can be easy. It can give you all the information you want to geek out and be really clear on what happened. So we feel great about where that technology is. We've spent 3 years developing it. It's in Photoshop right now. So if you use Photoshop, you can save your work, your edits, as in something called content credentials, which is fantastic. We created an open standard, as you mentioned, the C2BA. So we're on that with Twitter and Microsoft and a few others, creating an open standard, a standard that everybody can use and as a technical implementation to make an image version of this, a video version of this, and audio as well. And then just last month, we created the open source version of our technology. And that is taking our technology, one that's in Photoshop right now that captures that data. We made it open source. So anyone can just take that, put it in our own tools. Because we're not trying, this is not a profit center for us. We're not trying to make money off of this. We're just trying to show a way that we can all have this common understanding of facts again, because we think that's important for democracy. We think that's important for society. And because of our leadership in this technology area, we felt it was a role we needed to play.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It sounds like you're really trying to empower the users on the internet, and working with some of these partners sounds like a great way to do that. You know, the New York Times, for example, because they do host so much content on their website. What do you see as the next step for the content authentication initiative? Yeah,
so we, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I think one of the key things that is important, and again, Alex mentioned this in her remarks, is this solution puts the power to decide whether something is true or not in the hands of the users. So there's no judging that goes on. The information gets captured, it gets shared, the user looks at it, and they say, do I believe Senator Portman said that or not? Right? And they get to decide. The government is deciding. There's no tech company that's deciding. If it's a satire, we love satire. We love parodies. We love all of those things. We're Adobe. We want you to go crazy. Do whatever you want. Unleash your imagination. Make this image however you want to. But you're going to be authentic about it. You're going to show what happened. If you want to believe that what happened, that this was true. So that's the key. This gives the power to the user, and that's been important. And that's been important in the conversations we've been having, to your point, and what's next for it. When we talk about it with governments, and we've talked about it with the EU, and they're looking at in provenance technology into their AI Act. We've talked about it with Australia and Singapore, and here today, with all the meetings we're having, the thought that everyone's worried about is, we see this as a problem. We know what's going to happen. But we need this neutral way of solving it, because there's people on both sides of this issue, as there are on every side of this issue. Some want more control, and some want, less control over the solution. And this goes right in the middle and just says everyone gets to decide for themselves. I feel like that is an answer that so far has been speaking to most of the governments, because we do see a government role, and that government role is more around education. It's really around educating the public that you can't always trust what you see and hear, but there are tools that can help you figure that out for yourself, right? That has to be something that government take on as part of this. And then there's another piece of it that we're looking to just to elevate the discussion, right? We're doing here today, having this conversation where people understand that this is it's an extremely important problem, right? We have to solve this ability to trust in facts, and this is one of the tools that you're going to be able to look at and say we can use it as a solution.
So you spoke about the U.S. government, the Singaporean government, some of the other governments. One of the reasons, a main reason why we're hosting this event in D.C. today is because the topic of misinformation, disinformation, is attracting a lot of it among policymakers, including those on Capitol Hill. How do you see the government partnering with the private sector to try to address these problems, either through CAI or other methods that you're exploring?
So the Deepfake Task Force Act that we just mentioned, that's an investigation to public-private partnership into the question of whether or not authenticity and provenance is a solution to disinformation. And I think it's an important investment. for the federal government to be making, because we need to do the work to see what are the solutions that are going to make sense. We believe this is when there are other potential solutions out there. So having the work done of analyzing it with both private companies who truly understand the technology and where it's going, and public institutions, both government and NGOs, who understand really the values of democracy and want to be able to speak to those, bring them together, make sure that the solutions we end up choosing fill both constituents. I think that's really important. That's what this act will help do. But that's the conversation we need to do. We bring people together, public and private, in any way possible to have this conversation. We don't want the public, we don't want the government just to pick a path and just legislate, right? That doesn't always lead to the best solutions. And so we need to make sure that's an informed discussion. They understand AI, they understand where AI is going, they understand what deepfakes are, how they're made, and how you can solve for the issues. And together, I think we can come to a solution.
Yeah, great. I think we're very close to time, but I just have one additional question. What do you see in terms of next steps to scale up this sort of technological solutions? We'll be hearing today about a number of different technological solutions that can address different problems out there in the internet ecosystem. But how does this become more ubiquitous?
Yeah, so we're right at the cusp. I'm really excited to be here because the journey to get to an open standard, which we released in January, which was, I think, broke all records for standard creation, just 3 years. I mean, for those actually guys, applause maybe would be awesome. Thank you. So that was great because we really need to show that this is not an Adobe solution, right? That this is a group of people, it's an open standard, anyone can do it. And then really the next biggest milestone was the open source kit that we created, because there's a lot of companies without our resources who can't build the technology that we did. And so making it available. So now is the time where people can adopt it. So Nikon took that, for example. They're building a prototype with that open source software. So now we're at the time where companies can take it. So I feel good that this is the inception point, having this conversation, getting awareness out, getting the federal government maybe spotlighted in different ways, like the Deepfake Task Force Act, or a hearing, or different ways of bringing attention to it. But we'll continue to do our part about talking about it to our industry and the members of our coalition to make sure people are actually building it. But we're right there now. Like, now that we have the technology, it's in Photoshop, we have the open source version, the standard is out there, we're ready to go.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being here today. It's fascinating. We wish good luck moving forward on this project.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.
No fire required today, but thank you for that great conversation and great fireside chat. And we have another video with remarks from Representative John Katko from New York. Leave that up.
The current threat landscape is why the federal government. I'm Representative John Katko, ranking member of the House Committee on Homeland Security. I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you all in person, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak to you all about the critical work that needs to be done to secure our nation's cyberspace. Unfortunately, cyber attacks are becoming an increasingly part of everyday life for the average American. School systems, libraries, small businesses, healthcare manufacturing. These entities now have come to consider the very real threat of ransomware or malware. The current threat landscape requires a posture of vigilance. We cannot and should not let our guard down in cyberspace. A consistent and strong level of collaboration and communication is essential for understanding how the public and private sectors can work together to secure our nation's critical infrastructure. Because of the overwhelming legislative success we have had this Congress, it is my belief that our top priority should be turning toward oversight of the implementation of these legislative efforts. Next Congress, my colleagues will need to take a new look at this. This Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or SIIA, is at risk of being overwhelmed by the implementation of numerous pieces of legislation that Congress has passed this year. This is where what I call the SIIA 2025 effort comes in. The mission of SIIA 2025 is to mature SIIA via congressional oversight, increase resources available to the agency, and solidify lines of effort in the cybersecurity space. Congress has provided SIIA with significant resources, and it's important we conduct careful oversight to ensure the agency is efficiently and effectively carrying out the responsibilities we have tasked them with thus far. The diversity of the current threat landscape is why the federal government, including SIIA, needs to play a more effective and active and pivotal role than ever before. Charged by Congress with being the nation's lead civilian cybersecurity agency, SIIA has expansive responsibilities across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Since becoming the ranking member of the House Committee on Homeland Security, it has been my focus to mature SIIA as an agency and solidify the roles and responsibilities of the disparate federal entities charged with cybersecurity authorities. I believe SIIA should be and will be a $5 billion agency. And it's critical. And I mean critical that it harnesses the resources and responsibilities we have given it as it continues to steadily grow. Recently, Director Easterly made an important observation with which I strongly agree. We are now at the point where we need to move from information sharing to information enabling. That's what she said, and that's what I agree with. The discussions in Congress over the past decade have centered around information sharing, which is certainly important. But we also need to ensure that the information being shared with the private sector is actionable and meets the needs of a diverse set of shareholders and stakeholders. There must be a high-value proposition for entities to partner with SIIA. I look forward to continuing to work with them to ensure we are maximizing the effectiveness of these programs and that we understand what gaps need to be solved. All of this can't be done without a professional cybersecurity workforce and efficient operational organization. I have concerns that SIIA does not yet have the deep cadre of responsibility, deep cadre of cybersecurity professionals it needs and lacks a professional human resources organization to bring these individuals in and retain them. This is something I plan to focus on and encourage my colleagues to pick up on next term. However, I am pleased that Director Easterly is making this one of her top priorities. Again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. The House Homeland Security Committee and the Department of Homeland Security agencies we oversee benefit greatly from the close collaborative relationship that we maintain with industry. That relationship cannot change. In fact, it must be enhanced. And I hope you will continue to consider the committee as a bipartisan partner as we consider how to create a more secure and resilient cybersecurity ecosystem. Thank you and have a great day.
Wonderful. We're so grateful to the Congressman and to his staff for those remarks. I'm now going to call up our first panel if you want to start making your way to the podium. This is going to be moderated by Rebecca Kern, who is a tech policy reporter at Politico. I want to know for a fact that she is also covering the House privacy bill markup that is happening at the exact same time. So she has a lesson in multitasking today. She is joined by Sam Gregory, who is the program director at Witness, a wonderful organization that helps people use video and technology to protect and defend human rights, which we'll hear more about today. Hoden Omar, who is a senior policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, and Kate Crockett, who is senior advisor to the White House Gender Policy Council. Rebecca, I'll put it to you. Please take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me here? Okay. Share this. Thanks so much. We have a lot of problems to discuss before our panel today. We are the panel to discuss the problems of deepfake and malign information campaigns and how they pose a national security threat to us. So just to go down our panel and ask you to define some of the biggest problems you are tracking in your areas of research with deepfakes, malign information campaigns today, and some of the biggest threats these are posing to national security, just to start off where you're tracking these issues. Hoden can start, yeah. If you want.
So as a policy analyst, I think there are three kind of types of concerns that I'm sort of tracking. The first is misinformation in elections, which we've heard about a little bit already. The second is kind of non-commercial use cases or commercial use of images and videos of things like an individual using or creating a deep fake or a realistic looking image. It's not working. A realistic or a deep fake of perhaps a realistic looking pornographic image without a user's consent. And then third is commercial use case. I think sometimes this can be slightly overlooked. When you think about commercial use cases of deepfakes, think of celebrities, actors, high-profile individuals. They make a lot of money from the use of their likeness, and deepfake technology has advanced to the point that their likeness can be created digitally. What happens when they are not able to fully control how that is used, and what are the policy implications of it? So, for example, in Florida, there's a museum that is created a kind of virtual version of the surrealist painter Salvador Dali. Died in 1989. Is this what he wanted? Is this what his estate wants? If there are profits being made from this, what are the tax implications of that? There are all these sort of policy questions. And I think for all of the concern areas, what happens when we move to the metaverse? We talked a little bit about this earlier, but not just AI developing, but as augmented and virtual reality develop, what happens when we kind of combine these different technologies? What does a deepfake look like in the metaverse? What are the policy considerations there?
Followers next in line. It's great to be here. So the work that Witness does on deepfakes and authenticity and provenance springs out of our history as a group working with human rights defenders and civic analysts globally who try and create trustworthy information and challenge falsehoods. The research we do has really been following two parallel tracks for the last 5 years, and I'll talk about what we've learned in that. One is an initiative, and I think it's the only globally inclusive initiative on deepfakes, which we frame as Prepare, Don't Panic, which has talked to people who face existing mis and disinformation, gender-based violent threats about what they fear with advanced forms of media manipulation. And this has been a focus on authenticity and provenance. This whole area of work actually came from the human rights sector because they built tools to validate and prove war crimes for the past decade. And so from very early on, we've had an interest in how do you prove what is trustworthy, how do you show what's been manipulated. A few things that we have seen in the problem area now around those two areas. The first is that there are a whole kaleidoscope of threats that deepfakes potentially exacerbate, right? And I think that's why investing early in some of the solutions and thinking about how we address them is really important, right? So when we talked globally, and that includes, of course, the US, people pointed to existing challenges that journalists have in verifying information and under-resolve the media. They pointed to the existing problems of gender-based violence that target women in the public sphere and the private sphere with manipulated images. And they pointed to the reality that many countries' governments target their citizens with manipulated images. It's not just a state problem from outside. I think the other thing, and hopefully we'll come back later, is they also said that the majority of the manipulation they encounter are so-called shadow fakes, which is someone taking an existing image, miscontextualizing it, manipulating it, sharing it. And so as we think of solutions, they said, pay attention to fakes, but make sure your solutions work across the spectrum of manipulations. The final thing I'll say, and I think this relates to a national security framework, is in some senses, high-level politicians are the best protected in this context of deepfakes and inauthentic content. So many of the solutions we build are oriented towards both national security and national level politics. But the integrity of our democracies relies on everyone else being able to participate. It relies on human rights defenders, journalists, local politicians, and they are the ones, not only in the US, but even more so globally, who are left out of the solutions. So as we talk about solutions as well, I really want us to focus on how do we develop solutions that are globally inclusive, protect people who exist in truth-telling environments that are complicated, where privacy is compromised, where you can't trust government, all of those factors. So again, let's reflect in the solution side the needs of a diverse global set of people who want to share trustworthy information or have to challenge falsified or untrustworthy information.
Thanks so much. And so as both Sam and Horan have noted, the concerns that the Gender Policy Council, the Harris administration really have at the nexus of national security and gender-based violence, particularly are recognizing that significant volume of deepfakes and inauthentic content is designed with a specific intent to discredit, shame, and silence women, and particularly those with intersecting identities. And also noting that's happening at varying levels of digital sophistication, so you don't have to be an expert or equipped with specialized tools. For example, this group's familiar with, no doubt, AI-enabled notification apps, create images where people appear to be nude without their consent, and that those are proliferating at an alarming rate. But what's really important here to us is that regardless of authenticity, experience of harm that victims of these non-consensual intimate images in particular experience can be devastatingly real. It affects their personal and professional lives, and it impacts their mental and their physical health. But also importantly, fake and authentic sexualized images, their threats, their warnings, and their clear signals to women leaders in particular by both state and non-state actors that they must cease and desist from public and political life. It's part of the adversarial toolkit. And so it's a concern for national security because we know the rising threat of authoritarianism is often built on and tested through minimizing the space for and voices of women leaders and activists. And also to note that effects and magnitude of these consequences is greater than any one individual that is targeted. There are implications for our democracy, disinformation based on gendered and identity-based stereotypes and sexuality. It's a threat to our democracy because it undermines citizens' rights to impartial and fact-based information, and that then can lead to the makeup of democratic representation and threaten pluralistic and inclusive societies, which is our shared goal here.
Thanks for running down your areas of research, and this is really helpful. So, Sam, you alluded to shallow fakes, and could you kind of explain the difference between those and deep fakes and the prevalence you're seeing of one versus the other? You and I were talking about that separately, and I found it really interesting because I think we all think deepfakes are a lot easier to create than maybe they are, and it's really shallow fakes we've seen more of online.
Yeah, so both the research work and the very direct field work of Witness, so we work in many different global disinformation and human rights contexts. For example, right now, Ukraine, 99.9% of what we see I would not consider a deep fake, right? They are shallow fakes, and that is the phrase that people use to describe a video or a photo from one place that is claimed from another date or time, a video that might be lightly edited, for example, to remove content from within it or at the ends, or that might be a video that is slowed down, right, to misrepresent one's physical demeanor or health status. And those are the prevalent forms in both mis and disinfo campaigns, domestic and international, as well as across a range of different theme areas. So we could say that about Ukraine. We could also say that about COVID, mis and disinfo. And I think what's really important to know is that continues to grow in volume and diversity, right? So in Ukraine, we've seen increasing numbers of live stream shallow fakes, someone sharing a live stream claiming it's from another place. New platforms like TikTok are inherently based on the idea that you can remix and make it easier and easier to do this. And all of these are part of, a trajectory, and I think this is important as we look at solutions. And going back to what Dana said earlier, understanding that fakes are part of an evolution, right? They are a tool for editing and manipulation that builds on the existing ones. So as we think of solutions, we should be thinking on the continuum of what we can do around shallow fakes and deep fakes. There may be deep fake specific solutions, but what we heard very clearly globally was don't neglect the problems that exist right now. Make sure there are solutions to them. For example, reverse video search in a platform like YouTube or Facebook, and tools for authentication and provenance for people who want to show where their media comes from.
Yeah, and we heard discussion from Dana about C2PA's technical standards that that were issued earlier this year. How can you guys see those being beneficial to helping identify the provenance of misinformation and deep and fake videos? And how do you envision it being adopted globally now going forward?
I can speak to that because Witness was very deeply involved in the standards development. About 4 years ago, we published a report called Ticks or It Didn't Happen that was all about the key dilemmas to think about in building authenticity infrastructure. So we came to Adobe and others early on to talk about what we saw as the pros and cons of this. And the pros are super easy to understand, right? People can understand where their media comes from. It's about user empowerment. It's about thinking about showing your work, right? Which is, we know that as a phrase, maybe in so many different contexts, academic and creative. We've been very deeply involved on the Content Authenticity Initiative, and then we're part of the C2PA developing the standards. To your question, I think the really key moment, I think it's really important now, sitting here on the Hill, that we think about how we get this right? And Dana's referencing kind of where we're moving to now from, developing standards to implementation. Witness led the Threats and Harms Task Force in the C2PA, and I want to credit a standards body for actually trying to think proactively about what you want to prepare for in a potential technology, and actually naming the threats. And we named about 50 threats and harms that could go wrong. But I also think we need to name the ways in which we can address those. So how are we going to make sure, as this gets implemented, that people can create media without showing their identity, can redact and edit media, right? Creatively, but also maybe to protect their safety. And I think it's important to be clear-eyed about the leadership role of the US here, right? Is that, and I will say candidly, when I heard Dana mention Singapore, I instantly thought about the role of the Singaporean government actually in creating fake news laws that mandate things like journalists having to declare their identity. I think we have to be super cautious about the standards in the context of how we look ahead to how they might be used by governments that want to track their citizens, want to think about it, many of the areas Alex mentioned. So they have tremendous possibility now in institutions like C2PA. They're coming from a great place. How do we now move forward?
If I could just add, I think there are so many types of standards as well. Thinking about how are there standardized protocol, the ways in which we document the training data that's being used and the model, the hardware and experimentations, and are there standard protocols for the ways in which we track capabilities and are able to identify what the capabilities different researchers have. And what we're hearing, I think, from researchers and from the academic stakeholders is, no, we don't really have enough of that. And I think the problem is if you're not able to really identify those things, then you're not able to really understand the state of play. And you don't understand the state of play, then you can't strategically plan forward. I think one of the things that the United States has been historically very good at with standard setting is taking this approach of really bringing in academia, having it be industry-led, and really engaging every stakeholder that needs to be at the table. And so I think this is something that the U.S. can do well and should do well.
Kaylin, do you want to respond as to kind of the government's role here? And then we can also transition to some of the work your group is working on as well.
Sure. So I think that in all of this, whether we're talking about, thank you. I think that for all of these challenges that we're discussing, the focus here is that, as you said, it needs to be interdisciplinary and multisectoral because we're not going to innovate ourselves out of these problems, but we're also not going to legislate or regulate ourselves out of these problems either. It's a combination. It's a both and.
And while you're speaking, I wanted to see if you can speak to the Biden administration's latest presidential memorandum establishing a task force to address online harassment and abuse. It was announced last month. And maybe, there's a lot of news coming at us all the time. Maybe not everyone's heard about this. If you could kind of talk about the intent behind it and what you're hoping to achieve that task force to address online harassment, particularly towards specific women and minority populations.
Great, thank you. And thank you for this question and also for including me on this panel. It's really the exception that gender-based violence is a part of a discussion like this, and that's precisely why President Biden issued this memorandum on this topic. So I think we're all very aware that as the author and champion behind the original Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, nearly 3 decades ago, President Biden has long championed efforts to prevent and respond to gender-based violence wherever it occurs and whatever form it takes. And in fact, the reauthorized Violence Against Women Act includes some really historic provisions on addressing cybercrimes and having a definition for the first time for technology-based abuse, under which, when directed towards women in either their public or private lives, deepfakes, shallow fakes, very much I hear. And so recent events in particular really have underscored the facts known well by all of us, but especially women and youth and people of color, that the internet can be a hostile, unsafe site of hate, racism, misogyny. And these spillover effects do indeed have impacts threatening our communities and individuals offline. And that there is not a clear-cut distinction between our online and our offline worlds. It's very much a seamless continuum. And so establishing this task force really responds to the need for strengthened government leadership to address online harms, and really particularly looking at technology-facilitated gender-based violence. The idea is that it will produce recommendations for the federal government, state governments, technology platforms, schools, and other public and private entities to prevent and address tech-facilitated BV. It also, for the first time, defines the problem of online harassment and abuse and really discusses the breadth and depth of its impacts online and offline, and some of the forms that it takes, including malicious deepfakes. Also, just note here that the task force builds on and complements the work of the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to prioritize multilateral action to address gender-based online harassment and abuse globally, which we are doing as a pillar of our Summit for Democracy of Action, which I imagine that my colleague, Dr. Tim Moore, will be speaking about in a panel. But just to add some context with some numbers to this discussion. While this is not a stat specific to deepfakes or shallow fakes, we do know that 85% of women globally have experienced some form of online harassment and abuse. But again, that's the thing. It's not just about what happens online. It does lead to offline harms. They very much can lead to physical and mental health impacts. But importantly, there is a chilling effect for women leaders, human rights defenders, journalists that leads to documented self-censorship, disruptions to their political contributions. And so this is something that we really want to do is shift the conversation, stop minimizing these harms and saying that they are online only, and really give survivors real support.
And I mean, obviously, so much of our lives are lived online, and particularly with the pandemic, we've become so much more reliant on technology to communicate, and particularly social media. And I just kind of wanted to speak to, or if you guys could speak to, kind of trends you're observing on social media. I mean, as Sam referred to TikTok, and there's a lot of new evolving technologies and apps people are using today, wherein a lot of misinformation, disinformation, gender-based violence and attacks occurs, and it's really up to these companies so far to moderate. I mean, we have Section 230, a law from 1996 that really does put the power in the companies to yes, take down content, but also they won't be held liable in a lot of cases. There are several exceptions in a majority of cases. So I just want to kind of how you guys are observing these companies address the challenges, since we have an absence of federal legislation stepping currently to stop a lot of the disinformation we see on these sites.
That's such a broad question.
I know.
I'm going to keep it in the sort of the deepfakes and evolving forms of misinformation, just to get some focus for myself there. I think there's a couple of trends. One is, as I mentioned, and I use TikTok as an example, many other companies as well that are moving into a much more complex form of media production, right? And I think understanding how we move with that and don't carry our old assumptions about media into that, right? Like when most media is remixed, most media is repurposed, how helping people understand what is trustworthy within that. And certainly we've had strong words around what TikTok is doing and kind of its failures in Ukraine, but it's also just another example of what many platforms are grappling with, dealing with that type of media. In terms of deepfakes and how social media platforms are responding to them, there's this wave a couple of years ago of policies on deepfakes. And now it's really the question that we've been grappling with at Witness and in a number of other groups. We've been processed with the Partnership on AI and actually a number of other companies, including Adobe and Microsoft, about thinking about how do you look at the pipeline deepfake production in order to address potential harms from early on, right? How do you reduce the sphere of potential harms from deepfakes, and what are the roles of everyone along that pipeline? So, if you look at, a world in which more and more people are going to create remixed media and also synthesized media, it's going to be mixed up. Labeling, like just sticking a label on stuff, doesn't really work. Right? What are you going to label? You label the sunset because we changed the color. You label the soul because we adjusted it, right? Like, it's not practical. Instead, we need to be thinking is like, how do you have, and I think this relates to the authenticity work, but also to the ways in which we design the tools that make deepfakes, disclosure, the ability of people to understand how their media was produced, right? And so thinking about values that you want to have built into the technology, disclosure, assumptions on consent, and what are the red lines that startups moving into the area? Because remember, this isn't just the big tech platforms, a lot of startups in the synthetic media. How are they thinking about the red lines? How are they building in the red lines? Very obvious ones like gender-based violence. How are they learning about those? And then regulation will follow, or in the case of the EU, it's not following, right? EU legislation is happening, and it's going to start reinforcing those lines. So I think we need to think in a slightly different way about this. It may be, that we need to start thinking about a different form of media production, and we adapt to that. It's also about how we think about the pipeline of how media gets created and how we think about disclosing that process, a variety of ways, from content authenticity to the types of forensic trace that you can leave from a synthetic process, a whole bunch of ways. And the responsibility on that doesn't lie with the user. They have no control over the ability to do that if it's built into the pipeline.
I guess just a little bit to that. I think about this question, the role of these social media companies and the role of soft law versus hard law. And I think that, it's like, Kaylin says that you can't necessarily legislate yourself out of this problem, in part because, state and the country as a whole is limited by its jurisdiction, and this is a global problem. And in many ways, there are certain benefits that come from soft law and the role of social media companies in addressing mis and disinformation. One of those is that they are able to kind of have this global applicability and also this responsiveness. We've been seeing campaigns online to ensure that we keep pictures of people who are breasting up because that's something that people want, and it's not necessarily something that we want to censor. And social media companies are able to be responsive to in a way that I think, top-down government might not be able to be as responsive, and a kind of slightly slower moving kind of political process. And so I think there really is a balance of what government needs to do and also where soft law is really providing and improving and kind of supporting what hard law does.
And are you tracking the EU laws too in this space? Not necessarily.
I have an EU colleague, but
you're US. So yeah.
I am.
We'll
US.
get to that question.
I would just add to that echoing prior remarks, just that any whole of society problem, one that is truly borderless, does require whole of society solution approaches. So again, it's not just the tech sector, it's not just regulators or governments, but what is really essential is that we have civil society and we have researchers, and we are centering impact communities and survivors in particular with this work. We very much recognize the balance of powers, and the executive branch does not legislate. But what we can do, and we are committed to doing with this task force in particular, is really shedding additional light on the problem and bringing together different sets of stakeholders so that we can have discussions just like this. It's also just important to note, yes, many technology companies have expressed a commitment to improving user safety, addressing abuse on their platforms. Many do share this commitment to supporting survivors, to preventing abuse, to supporting human rights defenders and activists. Companies are led by human beings, though, so it's a mix across the board. And so I think we just need to be very clear-eyed, again, that it's going to take all of us to arrive towards something that's truly effective.
And I think you have to recognize these companies are largely publicly held, and they're delivering their holders, and maybe not always putting the user first. I mean, they would not fully admit to that, but there is an underlying profit to all these companies. So another issue that Alex referred to in her opening remarks is just the use of deepfakes by authoritarian regimes. And we directly or watch this happen live with the war in Ukraine and Russia. And I know there's a lot of examples out there, but I mean, we did see the U.S. government really take a stance ahead of the invasion, identifying malign information campaigns and getting ahead of it in a lot of ways. So how have you observed the U.S. and Russia kind of working and addressing and identifying deepfake and shallow fakes as the war has continued? Is the public still paying attention to these issues closely as the war started? That's a question, but how have you observed the deepfake campaigns evolve in the past few months now?
So at Witness, we've been very involved on multiple dimensions in Ukraine. We train and support people who document video evidence, and we also have been working on the mis and disinfo sides. I think Ukraine shows us the sort of the unfortunate petri dish of like all the ways in which media is manipulated, miscontextualized media, the new platforms like TikTok with new live stream re-edits or audio re-edits, the false flag operations and staged videos. In fact, it's cheaper probably to stage a video than make a real deep fake still. And then the trends in which people are trying to play with our strategy for trying to validate information, like the sort of so-called fake bunks. So people posing as people who are debunking something actually to create more doubt. And I think the other part of it that they've been observing is, of course, what people name as this goal is really not to create an unconvincing version of the truth, but to obfuscate what is going on with multiple conflicting versions. And so it raises the barrier for us, civil society, and civil society has a very important role as this, as well as government, civil society and journalists, to have the tools, because at the moment society is under-armed, under-equipped to deal with this. I think there's been one very prominent deepfake case in Ukraine that's very instructive about the future, maybe, which is folks will remember the Zelensky deepfake from March this year, not very well made. A lot of people laughed and chuckled and said, that's the best you can do. Deepfakes, they're overhyped. And we were very involved in looking at that deepfake and also understanding the circumstances. And this was the perfect circumstance for a deepfake, right? That the government had warned its citizens there was going to be a deepfake of this circumstance of Zelensky. He came on straight afterwards and said, that wasn't me. It was laughably bad. But when we've looked globally, you see that very similar settings where things are claimed as deepfakes actually do have impact. That when videos come out that kind of look plausibly like they could be true and you have none of that supporting structure, that in many societies people don't have access to the tools to debunk them. They exist in ecosystems where they can get circulated quickly and they're hard to debunk. So although we look at Ukraine, we say, phew, dodge the deepfake bullet in some sense, We dodged it because of the ability of Ukraine, because of the incompetence of the deepfake makers, because of preparedness of people in Ukraine, not because, in general, that we're well prepared for more media manipulation like deepfake. So I think it's really important to center that. And then there's another wrinkle, actually, which is the fake wrinkle in Ukraine, which is there was a similar video around the same time of Putin making a very similar statement that was released as satire a few weeks before the Zelensky one and was completely understood satire. Now, when the Zelensky video came out, it was re-released. Everyone thought it was disinformation. And I think this is one of the strongest challenge points on deepfakes, is the easy way you can trip across the line between satire and disinformation and claim someone misunderstood you. And so that's what we need to think about these tools as well, is to protect ourselves against people who dance back and forth across that line with photorealistic images.
And I have a question for Hoden. Specifically, you work in your role of advising lawmakers on crafting legislation often. And I want to see what you're tracking in the AI space. We heard Senator Peters and Congressman Katko speak to some bills they're working on. But generally, are there bills in AI, in the AI realm you're tracking? And also, what are the challenges to educating lawmakers on these highly complex issues that consistently are evolving, as you've alluded? And is legislation necessarily the best solution? Or how would you advise legislation be written so that it stays up to date with consistently evolving?
I'll start with the first part of what I'm tracking. So we heard about some of the bills that have already passed and what's being worked on, but there was also, 2020, there was and bear with me, the IOGANS Act, the identifying outputs of generative adversarial networks, good for me, which, really was a kind of R&D, requiring an NSF to kind of support research in deepfakes and manipulated content. And we also saw in 2020, as part of the NDAA, this provision that required the Director of National Intelligence to also do reporting around machine manipulated content. So I think there is specifically a handful of several deepfake specific bills, but I also think looking forward in terms of what I think lawmakers could be thinking about. One thing is really to think about or to investigate how the U.S. itself the U.S. government might be using deepfakes, and in what ways, disclosure or any of these other things that we've spoken about, what are their responsibilities? What's guidance for federal agencies as they look forward and start using these things? I think one particular area I think would be of great interest. And then there was another part of your question.
Well, just so that some of the challenges to crafting legislation as the technology consistently changes.
I think one of the challenges is that when we talk about AI or deepfake policy, immediately think regulation, but there are all these other things. I mean, what's our policies to R&D? What's our policies towards the talent that we need to really solve these questions? What's our policies towards having the relevant compute capabilities that mean that we can investigate these things? There's also trade policies. What about AI chips that are needed for these things? AI policy is so comprehensive and so broad. It's really a lot more than just regulation. Regulation is important, but I think in general, we need to be thinking more comprehensively about, at a higher level, what's our kind of strategy for these things. I do actually have a report coming out on this next week, so yeah, feel free to follow up.
Good preview there. Yes, so we have to wrap up, and wanted to just kind of see if you could quickly point to, and Hoden did preview a bit of it, but what is one area or solution that you could see a private or the public sector do in the next several years to help address or combat or identify the threat of malign information campaigns and deepfakes? Like one area you find promising. I'm not saying it will happen, but
I can begin, and I think just very clearly I would double down on what we've heard about digital literacy. All high school students, both here and across the pond where I'm from, he used to be from, civic is a required class, but today, to really engage in physics, you have to be able to understand online media, and those two things used to be separate. How do we bring those two things together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it.
So I have a wish on solutions, which is as we look at a range of solutions that we think about them as global, non-exclusionary rights protecting and protecting creativity as we go forward, as well as defending against mis and disinfo. I think looking at authenticity infrastructure through that lens is important in the coming years, and there's real potential. And I think look at detection of maliciously created deepfakes, but doing that in a way that creates access globally for people who are going to need to be on the front lines of that fight. If it's only the highest levels of the US intelligence agencies who have that, a journalist in Myanmar, Georgia, or Brazil who's just confronting it right now, we've really got to think about access to detection tools alongside broadly available protecting authenticity infrastructure.
So I think just a plea as someone who comes from the gender-based violence surviving world, which is just if you can build it, doesn't mean you should, is a good question to always think about, and particularly because too many of the builders and the doers and the coders of the programmers are not those with lived experiences of being disproportionately harmed or targeted with technology. So really thinking about and just knowing implicitly these are not necessarily new forms of abuse, but they are giving old abusers new tools with which to abuse. And so just really thinking and knowing that building into these products, looking at safety by design really critically, and just understanding that whatever will be built will be misused and it will be exploited, and women and girls, gender non-conforming individuals, people of color are the canaries in the coal mine for much broader systemic issue threats to our democracy.
Thanks, everyone. This was really informative and hopefully teed up the next panel that's going to be speaking more to policy solutions in this space. So thank you, everyone.
A warm thank you to all of you for that great and wide-ranging conversation. We have remarks now from Representative Ro Khanna of California, so we'll tee up that video now.
Congratulate SIIA for your conference and for convening time about the digital world. Everything has a digital component. Our phones, our cars, our appliances, the digits engulfing us. This became obvious to Americans when people started to work remotely, when people started to have so much of ordinary life, including our education, was online. At a time where the digital is all-encompassing, we need more than a safeguard privacy and prevent information. I wrote in Dignity in a Digital Age many of these issues, and I've championed many of these issues the United States Congress. I have stood for an Bill of Rights, which would minimize the data. The speaker asked me on the Internet Bill of Rights, and here's first, it would make sure that we're opting in of our data, not just clicking blindly in giving. Second, it would create a fiduciary duty for companies not to, that is beyond what they need. Now, why does this matter, Dave? Because it will prevent these companies, big tech companies, from separate social media profiles and then targeting people to join groups that are engaged in misinformation. I believe in the First Amendment. I have no problem if someone wants to have a flag online. But what I don't agree with is still using data to join the Flat Earth Society. That's what's going on. This is not about suppressing speech. It's about the targeting of people using Alameda. And then we need basic consumer protection. You can't have a situation are facing suicidal thoughts and depression disorders because of a a product that is being. We wouldn't tolerate that in the physical world. We shouldn't in the online world. The FTC needs to regulate for minors. Amendment applies to minors, but you can have consumer protections. And we need protections against the incitement of violence online, and say that you're going to plan the assassination on January 6th at a specific time and place and claim the Section 230. Currently it is, but that's why it needs reform. It should be able to find that speech incites violence and the removal of that online. These are the types of comments that can protect speech, but protect participating online. And that is, I think, us have to work towards to strengthen in a digital age. Thank you for participating. Thank you. I look forward to working with you on this challenge.
Wonderful. Representative Khanna with a really important reminder that there is a connection between privacy, misinformation, and online extremism. Sometimes it's hard to connect those dots, but it's an important piece of the conversation. I'm going to invite up the final panel of the day, which is moderated by my friend, Jeff Joseph. We have Mallory Nodal, my colleague from CDT, Dr. Amla, who is the Senior Science Advisor at the National Science Foundation and co-chair of the Information Integrity Research and Development Interagency Working Group, and Dr. Tim Moore, who's Director for Technology and Democracy at the National Security Council. Thank you for joining us in such a busy time. We're thrilled to have the conversation.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks everyone for sticking with us throughout the day. Thanks to the panel. We've had the previous panel lay out some of the threats, and now it's time to examine some opportunities to address some of those threats. There's no single silver bullet to address the challenge of misinformation online. The threat's global, large and real, and requires us to use myriad tools in response. And as Kaylin noted, it requires collaboration between the public and private sector. So I'm pleased to welcome our next panelists who come from those three sectors, and we can discuss how each is addressed the threat, opportunities to collaborate, and what more needs to be done. I'm going to start, Mallory, I'm going to prepare you. I'm going to speechify just for a second, but I promise I'll get to a question. In the previous panel, we heard concerns about responsibilities of technology companies in this area, and that's really absolute. There's some responsibilities. We heard Representative talk about so there's responsibility as well, but as we've heard today, technology companies are responding and creating the tools, and I think the point is that, while there's more to be done, the companies we've discussed here today and others are taking some steps, but as you and I have discussed offline, there's a deeper problem. It's not just about online, but it's really offline, and some of these are just human behaviors. So I'm going to give you a softball to start. How do we address those offline behaviors that can lead to some of these negative online behaviors in misinformation?
Sure. I actually think that there are some online behaviors too that are related to this that may be within scope so far. So I don't have slides, but I'm going to ask you to do a couple of visualizations since we are talking about media. I think it's good to have visuals. And maybe we'll draw from the modern day wisdom. Every major social media platform is just screenshots of other major social media platforms. So imagine, you're on your favorite social media platform and you see a screenshot of, and below that tweet, whatever the content is, see a bunch of interactions, retweets, likes, and that, if volume is really high, that actually gives I think people sort of cue that, others have seen this, others have interacted with it, so it has some truth to it. And I think that's why we see the screenshot include those stats. Another visualization, imagine you're on maybe your favorite sort of messaging platform in group chat. Somebody sends you an image, maybe it has a title attached to it, maybe it's a screenshot from a website or a news website, and it's got a watermark on the image. But it's just a screenshot, right? That watermark didn't come from anywhere. It wasn't generated by any sort of truth-telling. It can actually just be add-on. But again, that watermark is meant to sort of indicate that image is maybe trustworthy, even though it can be faked. But then I'll give you a last visualization, which is what was introduced during the pandemic. It's pretty ubiquitous now on the major ones, which is that there's content out there maybe about the pandemic, but underneath that content, separate from that content, is a little bit of a bump. that tells you, maybe it doesn't actually tell you anything about the content, but it just encourages you to go elsewhere to learn more about COVID-19 or to learn more about your local election polling station or something. So these are behaviors that are really common and emerging as cultural behavior online, but are not necessarily included in the scope of sort of trust media. And I want to make sure we talk about them because I think that gives us an indication of it's not like there isn't trust online. It already exists in different forms. You might just need to be sort of moving it in a different direction. So we're sort of changing behavior, not introducing new behavior with something like online digital trust. So I don't know how long you want me to go on, but I have, I think I can stop there.
Well, actually, I'm going to ask you to go on a little bit because
sure.
I'm fascinated and we'll get to others as well. We've got a little bit of time, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to talk about how we already have another area in the online world that engages the in trying to verify digital information. And that's the sort of secure transport of web pages. So you see the green lock button in your web browsing. This allows you to, most people think of it as a security thing, right? You put your username and password in to log into your bank account. That gets sent securely. And then you download a web page that has your balance on it. That also is sent to you securely. But another feature of that is authentication. It's actually your browser's authenticating that that website is trustworthy. Well, I'm going to get to that in a second. It's authenticating to you that someone has attested that they own that website and that they've authenticated it. But when we we've found over time that this TLS 1.3 is the standard responsible for that, because I also work in standards and especially internet standards. We found over many years that giving use too much information, too much visual information, too much even hovering over that, or differentiating some of these certificates more trustworthy than other certificates, that doesn't work. Users need really straightforward cues, and also I think need to be reminded that, you know, that sort of acknowledgement that there's someone behind that website who has authenticated the existence of that website doesn't actually mean you can trust it, right? So websites dedicated to misinformation still get a TLS certificate. You can deliver malware with TLS certificates. It doesn't mean you should trust it implicitly because of the information it's providing you. It's more of a sort of machine-to-machine verification process. And I think that's kind of also in the realm where we should be teasing out some of the issues with trying to then give indicators and digitalizing the trust relationship with media. So maybe we can come back to some of the other stuff later.
We'll talk about media literacy, and that's a segment of media literacy that I hadn't thought about, or technology literacy. Well, let's jump in. Tim, the White House has made advancing technology for democracy a pillar of its foreign policy, as highlighted in December's Summit for Democracy. What can you tell us about the status of the administration's efforts to advance a democratic vision of technology?
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for all of you for being here today. Let me maybe provide a quick just overview for those of you who haven't been tracking the Summit for Democracy and what the White House produces every single day as closely as we do in the White House. The president, as you know, has been very focused on strengthening democracy, and be it home or when he travels abroad, it is one of his focus areas of making sure that we highlight the importance and the historic moment we are currently in for democracy around the world. As we heard earlier today, Congressman Katko spoke about cybersecurity. We just heard Congressman Khanna spoke about privacy. Peter spoke about the specific bill focusing on deepfakes. And what Mallory was just highlighting is how we have different levels of lever that we can pull as we think about technology and democracy. There is the technology layer, the protocol that Mallory was just speaking about, or the solution that we heard earlier being presented with respect to deepfakes. And then you have the application and the behavioral layer where the users come into play, and the companies and the role of the government. What the Summit for Democracy sets out to do is to be a vehicle to drive change across a number of areas. And I would say that from our vantage point, focusing on technology democracy, there are two main pillars for how we conceptualize the work that we do and hope to achieve in the coming years. First one is outlining what our affirmative vision is for technology democracy. Many of you will be familiar with the Internet Freedom Agenda that Secretary Clinton launched back in 2011. You know, a decade has passed since. In the spring of this year, we launched and announced the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, together with 60-plus countries at the White House. That isn't just focused on human rights, but also focuses on connectivity, the way we do business, which is the multi-stakeholder approach. And we've also started to expand beyond the conventional focus on digital and internet policy by having a series of processes focusing on artificial intelligence and building on the work that the previous administration started. For those of you who've been following, for example, the December 2020 executive order on focusing on artificial intelligence. So the first pillar is outlining what we stand for. And this is very much with a view of there is a global environment, and there are some countries who have different vision for what technology should look like and who controls technology. And then the second pillar is countering the improper use of digital technologies. And I think that focus reflects some of the lessons learned over the past decade, where if you think back to Secretary Clinton's speech, that was very much in the spirit of the Arab Spring, the use of information and communications technology to empower people on the street, and who were exercising fundamental human rights. And as we know now, digital technologies can also be used to suppress those rights. And what we've done over the past year is taking a series of actions, be it focusing on foreign commercial spyware, be it focusing on transnational repression, where the administration has also been very clear that we are not only going to outline what we think everybody should be doing, but where we are also taking steps to hold actors accountable if they are not acting in line with how they should and in line with international human rights. So that's the dual approach, and the Summit for Democracy is the key vehicle that our team is focusing on, and has 4 lines of efforts that were announced in December that we're currently taking forward through the year of action. So happy to go into more detail later on, but just in terms of the scene set and how we're thinking and conceptualizing our policy approach to technology and democracy right now.
Thank you. Before we move on, and can you describe the global response thus far?
So the Summit for Democracy was one of the largest head of state gatherings in history with over 100 countries. The commitments are not limited to those of the U.S. government, but every country that participated provided a list of commitments, including in the area of technology and democracy. So we're working closely with the State Department on now advancing and holding and work with the other countries to make sure that we implement the commitments ahead of the second for democracy that we are preparing now. And we're getting now in the weeds, tech cohorts for different areas that are being created that are multi-stakeholder in nature, that include civil society and also industry to then implement the commitments that were announced in December of last year.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Spearheading important programs in information integrity at NF. Well, first, you mentioned this earlier before I get to this other question. You just talk a little bit about, people don't always understand the work of NSF and the role the role that it plays, and think that you do the research. But can you describe the actual work of NSF to provide context first?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Here?
Yeah. So NSF, we're not a bunch of scientists at NSF that are actually doing the research. What we do at NSF is we actually create programs. We fund mainly academic, but also non-academic researchers to actually do the research. And this is on with a very, what we consider a gold standard peer review process, where we actually bring in and hold panels and bring in academics from all over the country and internationally and our industry. And many of our programs are NSF-owned programs, and many of them are interagency programs where we partner with colleagues in other agencies to actually create a joint program. And of course, we have a lot of industrial partners as well. So when it makes sense, we partner with the people to make sure we have the right focus. And our peer review process selects the best proposals and the sort of research to fund.
So it's not producing it, but providing a forum to
Enabling
identify and enabling. Thank you very much. You specifically are spearheading some programs in information integrity with the interagency working groups. Part of this includes designing strategies for preserving information integrity and mitigate effects of information manipulation that discussed on the previous panel. Can you talk to us a bit more about these programs and their current state?
Right. We have a bunch of programs at NSF. We have our flagship cybersecurity program. It's called Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace. And it looks at many different notions of trust, information integrity being one of them. Security, privacy, and a whole host of others also comes under that umbrella. This is a research program that is highly interdisciplinary. And that's one thing I thought a lot of people talk about it a little bit, but that's one thing I really want to highlight. I'm a computer scientist. I'd love for there to be a technology solution to this problem. But this is not. This is a socio-technical problem. It needs a socio-technical solution. We really need to really consider what is driving people to consume, create, and propagate this information. And we also, when we come up with interventions, really need to think about how people are going to perceive those interventions. It's really okay to have a big TLS certificate, but how many people truly understand what that means? And how is it going to change their mind, changing their behavior, and how they are using this digital media and things of that sort? So our programs are all, they have social, behavioral, and economic aspects to it. There's, of course, the computing aspect, there's the engineering aspect, and most importantly, I think I'll trip down on what Hodan said, the digital literacy. Not just in the formal education, not just in the formal sense in education at all levels from K through 12 all the way to graduate school, but also in the informal sense. When someone's using a particular platform, can you immediately give them feedback on whether the behavior they're indulging in is dangerous, or whether they are consuming things that are not really verified or validated? So I think that we do need to do foundational research, because there's a lot we don't understand. This is not anywhere close to being a solved problem, the ones that we're facing today. And again, what Hodan said, we don't know what we're facing down the line, right? Augmented reality and virtual reality, we don't even fully understand how those media can be used to actually attack or spread disinformation or fake. We just don't know. Those are threats on the horizon, and so we do need foundational research, we need interdisciplinary research, and we really do need to focus on education.
We're rushing into the metaverse with a sense of how some of these behaviors may translate. I should have asked you my threshold question, because you raised it there. So can you give us a sense of research being done to sort of, because again, it seems to me we talk about technological challenges, we can talk about technological solutions. At one point, it's human behavior, and it may be exacerbated by what goes online, no doubt, or facilitated. But are we seeing research begin to look at these human behaviors and how we begin to address?
Yeah, so the program I mentioned, the Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace program, took this approach 10 years ago. And a lot of what's being debated right now has its roots in research that was done 10 years ago using this approach. So we're always trying to stay ahead of the curve so that we are ready when the challenge is actually upon us. But getting people to work together is a challenge. And we often, and we shouldn't, but often the way things work is you develop a technology, you deploy it, then you figure out what's wrong with it, then you start trying to solve that particular problem, and so on, and we're in this loop. And then education comes at the end, right? Then you teach people how to use it after you've designed it. So what we are actually advocating is that get these people together to design these solutions, and to have education go hand in hand with the development of these technologies, so that when we deploy them, we're also ready to educate people on how to effectively use them.
Again, Speechify news, it's technical digital literacy is important, but basic media literacy also needs to be important. How do I differentiate between an opinion editorial versus editorial? How do I understand what's real news source versus these mouse sites? Mallory, part of your work is focused on digital trust, going back to sort of technology. You're familiar with a number of technological approaches to minimizing the risks that the misuse of AI technology have on the internet ecosystem and users. What solutions have you found to be most promising this one?
Yeah, and so I'm happy to go back to some of what I was picking up on before, where we can learn lessons from other technologies that have attempted this in the past. I think that we're all sort of getting at this place on the panel. There's consensus now that collaboration across many sectors and many different entities is critical. So if we go back to that visualization I had at the end, right, where you have a piece, either it's media or a social media post, and then the social platform itself has inserted a pointer to you to go elsewhere and learn more information. That's an example of placing something in context, whereas I think the media itself cannot contain that. You need, and then the parallel with the transport security was that the browser is the thing that is telling you something about the website, not the website itself. So in the case, I think, of media, we need to think about where that indicator lives, how it's shown to the user, and how to keep that simple, right? So that users can get out of it, so that it's actionable information that they can verify elsewhere, and so that it means something. And I think there was another thing brought up in the panel just at the very end. I think, Sam, you mentioned it, which is you need to be able to revoke certain kinds of information, but also revoke the trustworthiness too. I mean, it could be that, in fact, as is the case with the TLS certificate authorities, we were seeing that certificate authorities in Russia were spoofing certificates. So you have to not only worry about the websites they're spoofing, you have to cut off their ability to give certification. So that, in this case, would be the folks, I think in the scheme, they're signers. So they're the people that are sort of stamping the media, saying that, yes, this photo was taken here and it's done. The signer would sort of, in a way, need to be able to revoke that, work with other signers in a community, set standards for that, be able to react in rapid response when there's been a breach or when there's been an untrustworthy piece of behavior. And that's all to sort of maintain, I think, what is the human side of trust, not the digital trust. Digital trust is very narrow. It's very specific. It's just a sort of machine communicating with machine. It's not trust with a capital T. It's not human trust. And so to be able to maintain that, you obviously need a lot of people and a lot of layers of collaboration. So you don't just need collaboration with camera manufacturers and publishers. You also need collaboration with social media companies that are going to be the ones to sort of create visual marker for users of what they're seeing. And so that just is, it's a great opportunity, but it's also hard. As Nima pointed out, working with people can be hard, but ultimately, if it's an ecosystem-based solution, you're going to have a healthier ecosystem overall. But I'll just end with one thing that still worries me as potentially like question to others, and maybe you all out there is, when we sort of take digital trust, and which is a really narrow expression of trust, does that actually improve trust overall, or does it maybe make us question our sort of more human instincts around trust? I mean, example I think is that, as I was listening to, I was listening to the fireside chat, I feel like on some level we should trust journalists. We should trust journalists whether or not they have really fancy cameras or are able to get their media signed. I think that always sort of coming up with a text solution where the absence of that text solution indicates distrust is somewhat of a risk. So I don't know, even as a technologist, don't always know that the technology is improving the situation, and sometimes it might actually be making it a bit worse. Just worried.
Please, Tim.
To just add to Mallory's point about the role that technology can play, there are a couple of other examples where technology can help rebuild trust when the fabric is being eroded. And to your point, it's a combination of trust in the technology, trust we have amongst humans, and to pick up again on Congressman Katko's comment about cybersecurity, if we think of multi-factor authentication, to ensure that the person requesting access to a specific account is actually the person who owns the account, and that has become a big focus area for SIIA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency you heard earlier, to encourage users to use multi-factor authentication. If with Twitter, that the fact that public figures have the blue tick so that you know that it is the actual profile. Something that we are trying to help advance through the Summit for Democracy is privacy-enhancing technologies that, again, go to, given the current focus on artificial intelligence and a lot of the concern that we've about how machine learning and algorithm could unintentionally discriminate between users, there's certain other technologies that allow us to use the promise that artificial intelligence holds and combine it with privacy-enhancing technologies so that you can still analyze the data for public purposes or otherwise, and still minimize the risk that we have from a private perspective and the broader kind of domestic policy agenda. So highlight that. To your comment, it's a socio-technical discussion, and we can't focus on one or the other, but really they're in tandem. And then the key question becomes, how can you help make sure that people know what privacy-enhancing technology is, that people know what the green lock stands for? And that goes back to earlier reference to digital literacy. How do we get people to actually connect the dots between the technological infrastructure and what they represent in terms of trust relationships?
So I want to follow up a bit. Tim, I recognize that your focus is largely on promoting democratic values, but as we have this discussion, we've talked about the role of government and meeting researchers and promoting research, talked a little bit about some technology approaches, a little bit of digital literacy. What are the roles of the federal government play in addressing these issues? And I recognize you come here speaking specifically, but if you feel comfortable answering, responding.
So the federal government can play a variety of roles, and I would distinguish first between the role that it can play domestically and then the role that the federal government can play internationally. At the National Security Council, we obviously focus on the international dimension of this, where we're currently in an environment where, if you look around the world, there is democratic backsliding around the world, and there is active petition about what the future, not just of the internet, but emerging technologies look like, and some countries who do not represent our values being very effective in getting other countries to buy their technology or use the technology. So that's where there's a fusion between national security interests and the democratic values we stand for. Domestically, the federal government, again, used the analogy to cybersecurity, which prior to this current role on the White House was my focus at DHS. We've been using a number of different levers for the federal government, be it the power of the purse and the federal government's ability to shape the ecosystem through contracts, the federal government's use of technology itself. Setting an example where post the intrusion of SolarWinds and the very long executive order that I'm sure everybody has read, all 30-plus pages, that sets out specific and is fairly prescriptive in terms of the use of encryption, other specific technological standards to increase the way that we protect networks. So the federal government can play a number of different roles. Last but certainly not least, and there are others, the convening power of the federal government, given that this is a multi-stakeholder conversation in many ways. So let me end here because that was all.
No, good. Thanks. Thank you very much. Nina, you get to sit at this perch where you get to see a bit of the private sector work. How can the private sector continue to work with the government or on its own accord address information manipulation and these issues?
So I would say data. So I think where the private sector could really help is to make data, use case scenarios, and some details about the internal working of the algorithms, transparency with respect to their platforms. If they make those available for research purposes, then I think we can come up with more generalized solutions. So right now, a few of the platforms actually release some partial data, and so everyone's using that data, and they're training their algorithms and developing their solutions based on one small part of what they're seeing. But that's the only data they have. So we're missing out on a lot of more generalizable solutions because we really don't have access to the data, the platforms, and the use cases. And I really think just data on its own is not useful. You actually need the use case scenarios. You need things like that, the context around the data. So I think that's one thing they can really do. I also think the platforms and the private sector can also really help with the digital literacy and media literacy aspects as well. I really do think that you can't expect someone to go off and take a 1-hour course on media and digital literacy and then have them actually connect that back to something that they're doing on a particular platform. So if you can have the platforms, have this integrated within the platforms, or have the platforms participate and make those tie-ins, I think that would be another thing that could be really useful. And finally, a lot of our researchers actually engage one-on-one with many of the companies that were mentioned, and they have very fruitful collaborations, but it doesn't extend to everybody. So engaging, I think, with funding agencies like NSF or any of the other more mission-focused agencies that also have science and technology programs, and bringing their not just their expertise, but their problems and their specific needs, etc., and bringing those into joint programs would be something that would be really
solutions as well that can inform broader conversation.
Absolutely, and we always have industrial panelists at NSF, and we welcome that very unique perspective. So that's something that would also be really
useful. Advertisement for your work. I'll round it out. Now we talked about governments, we talked a little about private sector, a little bit about civil sector. What about end users, those who actually consume the media, interact and engage in the online world? So it goes back a little bit to the sort of social responsibilities and human behavior, but any other insights?
Yeah, I would just say that I think I'll place a lot of concerns in this bucket, just because I do think that end users are a great source of culture and innovation when it comes to taking media, remixing it. We shouldn't undervalue these sources, right, where we're taking maybe things that are facts, but making them fact-y or fact-adjacent, or to make points, to make political points, to express oneself. And so obviously as public interest advocates and social justice advocates, we worry about free expression and the right to information, the information controls that can be introduced when in a data-rich environment, right? So the more data there is about something, the easier it is to control. The more data you have about users, the easier they are to control. Like these sorts of, I guess, sort of tautologies are really very much based on facts and demonstrable data. That we've developed an intuition around. We've been able to see. So just worry a little bit about that. That we should continue to, consume and encourage users to remix content. So it could be that there are different realms here that we're talking about, right? And that the sorts of, I think the parallel I was making before about transport security and authentication should really end, at a certain point, because the ability to publish on a website, should be a publisher, is very different than creating content. They should be considered really worlds apart. So where we are introducing software controls and technical architecture designs, because sometimes gatekeeping is important, sometimes making value judgments is important, sometimes being arbiters of truth is important. It's also, we should also be conscious of the end user realm is one in which there should be no controls of that kind. And that is not to say that there should be no accountability or no transparency, but that they're very different and they're operating different realms. So we should think about applying these kinds of solutions with that in mind. But of course, end users need to be conscious of that as well, the sharing of information. And I would also say that there are different kinds of users as well. There are those with platforms and blue check marks that maybe should be held to a higher standard than those who are, communicating with friends and family and expressing themselves online. When you have a really high profile and you have sort of a verified presence, you need to be thinking a lot more carefully about the kinds of things you share and in the context you share them, and then what your audience will take from that. Because that human element of trust, or I trust this person, I follow them, they are famous, they are my thought leader, that is a lot more powerful, as we know, than any kind of icon or visual that we might find in a digital platform. And so I think we should include in the points that folks have brought up about how to educate users and media literacy, we also need to think about that particular layer. I loathe to use the word influencer, but it is potentially a different kind of user.
I think it's fair in this context. I can go home and tell my teenagers that the word influencer came up at our panel today, so there's that. I won't, but I'll just raise it in general. And you know, the fact that the term fact adjacent is now a term that we use, it sort of underlies this problem in and of itself. We have a few minutes before I wrap up. Tim, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work of the Freedom Online Coalition, the declaration in terms of catalyzing governments to take actions, or where that stands. Just share that a bit.
Yeah, and maybe for all of you, we are currently in the midst of the year of action between the first and the second summit, and have rolled out a number of initiatives where there are opportunities for a variety of stakeholders to become actively involved, just governments, but also companies, civil society groups. The Freedom Online Coalition, which has been around for a decade, is something that the U.S. should chair for the first time ever next year. It is now a coalition of 30+ countries, and we've committed to strengthen and expand it. After a decade, our lessons learned and best practices and recommendations that we are keen to receive so that it can inform our strategic planning moving forward. Beyond Freedom Online Coalition, there is the Declaration for the Future of the Internet that was just launched, where we want to make sure that it is effective and can be implemented and used in different contexts. And then we have a number of partnerships that were launched at the Summit for Democracy. For example, there's a university in Madrid that is taking forward what's called the Technology for Democracy Prize Challenge that is trying to identify and create a network of social entrepreneurs that are focused specifically on developing technology that supports democracy and focuses on humans and creating that network. So there are different opportunities for either the technologists, be it civil society organizations, governments and industry, to really use this moment that we're in right now, not just with respect to the political momentum, but what the president keeps highlighting is that we are at a historic inflection point, and making sure that all of us who care about democracy and human rights seize this moment and try to drive action. So we hope you will join us on that journey in the coming weeks and months.
Well, thank you. We look forward to it. I'm going to close with one last question. Rebecca sort of stole my, I don't know if she saw my, she stole my question, but the one thing that needs to be done in the sectors that you represent, or what currently gives you the best hope. So I'll give you 5 seconds to think. And I'll start with Nina.
I would say I'll go with 2. So interdisciplinary research needs to be done, not only to defend against today's problems, but to actually protect ourselves in the future. And I would say also just trying to get people to, sort of instill, if you will, in society critical thinking. Like really think about what you're doing and inform choice. So people don't understand when, in private GDPR is this big, even I can't go through it. But all they see is they see a pop-up every time they go to a website of a whole bunch of cookie options. I mean, some people understand what it is, most people don't, and they take the most permissive thing. So we need to really have people make informed choices when they actually engage online.
That's very wise. That's a good counsel. Mallory?
Yeah, mine's similar. I think that there need to be more social media platforms involved in the C2PA to actually start being able to pull information out of media and display it in context rather than on itself. So it's a very specific technocratic thing that can be done. But I'm also really excited by the fact that this initiative can bring together a lot of different people who can continue to coordinate. Because if we learn from the browser forum, the certificate authority community, there's a lot of chatter and back and forth about them. In fact, one of the ways that you maintain your status as a certificate authority is you have to be responsive. And if you don't send back emails and nobody can contact you within a certain amount of time, you get removed as a CA. So I want those engaged to be engaged and helping solve problems, not just implementing once and being done. It's actually got to be a community effort that thinks about this particular issue in a long-term forum, and that has a lot of promise.
Good. Tim, we'll round out with you.
I'd say 2 things that make me hopeful. The first one is that many of you here in the room grew up as digital natives and, unlike me, didn't have to make the jump. Therefore, with respect to future policy planning, you don't have to make that translation exercise anymore of people who are decision makers or otherwise. The next generation will have that knowledge intrinsically. They will have had their own lived experience design, good or bad, that will inform the way that they think about what the future will look like online. So I think that is one, just with any technology. And then second is our ability to innovate and to learn from the past. We think about the pandemic and what world it would have been if we wouldn't have had the internet and a lot of the communications tools that have been developed, and what our lives would have been like during those 2 or 3 years. I think there is now some interesting research coming out of the human rights community and academic research demonstrating some of the potential risks that come with being so much more online now that we need to be focused on, so that we don't inevitably end up in a world that we did not want to end in. But those are the two main factors that make me hopeful that we'll try to leverage.
We'll carry that optimism and hope forward. I want to thank my panel. That was outstanding. Thank you. That concludes our program. I want to thank all our panelists and thank you all for staying throughout the day. Thanks to our partners at CDT and Alex and her team for just an outstanding conversation that will continue. So look for more of this, hopefully in partnership with CDT. So thanks again. We'll look forward to seeing you in the future.
I think I must have your email then.
Google me, my email comes up, and
I'd love to reach out to that. Yeah, because what is your role here? You're on, are you a director at NSF? Okay. Right. Yeah, you too.